Hey there, friend. It's Michael, and welcome to another episode of the follow up question. I have a question for you as we get started today. When was the last time you changed your mind? Welcome to the follow up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. If you took just one day and wrote down or jotted down every time someone tried to change your mind in an entire 24-hour period, I don't even know how many little tick marks you would end the day with, but I'm guessing it would be a lot. If you were to sit back and just consider how often someone is trying to change your mind, it often comes in the package of evidence, data, proof, trying to get you to change, in some way, trying to force you to change. But that's just it. Unless we've already kind of made up our minds about change, it's really hard to make it happen when all we rely on is evidence, data, and proof. And that is what my guest in this episode is here to talk about. Michael McQueen is the author of Mindstuck, Mastering the Art of Changing Minds. And if my book was the storytelling version of how to change someone's mind or what happens when someone does change their mind, Michael brings in all of the facts, the data, and the evidence. It's an interesting dichotomy that we actually talk about in this conversation. But I want to make some points here as we roll into this conversation with Michael. As he writes in his book, we actually love evidence, data, and proof when talking about changing minds. It's just that we tend to use those things to justify what we already have believed or what we already believe in ourselves. We are so driven by our subconscious and the identities that we make up based on who we have interacted with, who we live with, who we're around most of the time, who has guided our lives. And as Michael writes in his book, when exposed to unfamiliar information or ideas, we tend to unconsciously be guided by the question, what would people like me think about an idea like this? Identity tends to trump inquiry. So how does it happen? How does change happen? Well, that's exactly what Michael and I are about to discuss. You reference yourself in the book as someone who is a very stubborn individual. I got to start by asking you, what is something that you've changed your mind about recently?
It is a great question. And then you can speak about the philosophical things, and there are, philosophical or ideological things that I've reconsidered even in the last few weeks or the last few months, but even very practical things. Like, for instance, so we live in Australia, in Sydney, in the suburbs. I didn't grow up in a big city. I grew up in a regional area. So one of the things I've never done is like really worry too much about locking my doors. So I'm pretty chill. Like I'm sure no one's going to break in. It'll be all right. So we have this phrase in Australia called "she'll be right," which basically means throw caution to the wind, don't stress too much. It's a very Aussie way to think about life. Anyway, so I've always had that mentality and somewhat smugly scoffed at the people who put bars in their windows and multiple locks. I'm like, come on, just chill out, guys. Anyway, so I've had this mentality for years. That's the sort of that's who I am. I'm a laissez-faire, she'll be right, it's all good. We had dinner a few weeks ago with a mate who's a cop. So he's a police officer, and we're talking about locking up doors. And I said, "Yeah, I often go to bed, particularly in summer. I'll leave the window open or don't lock the door." And his face was like, "Are you serious? What do you mean you don't lock your doors?" And he grew up like about 5 blocks from where we live, so he knows the suburb, he knows the area. He said, "So what you need to know is like the number of people that come into the area, they break in, they look for car keys, they steal cars, and he decided to give me some details and some information. And because I trust him, I know him, he knows me, he knows the area. I mean, I've had so many conversations with people who said I should be more serious about security, but I changed my mind. So we are locking doors now. We are that family. Just because it was like there were lots of things about that exchange that like were different to other conversations I'd had. I've had people try and change my mind around that. I haven't. In fact, I dug my heels in more. I said, no, I'm not the sort of person who does that. This one did change my mind. So there's that. I mean, the other thing I've noticed in the last few weeks, I have a few colleagues who are getting really into psychedelics. Like these are full, proper corporate executives who are going off to retreats and taking micro doses of drugs and saying it's awesome. And I mean, up until probably the last month or so, I was sort of like, that's not the sort of thing that someone like me would do. Like I'm not a taking drugs kind of guy. And yet when I see people who I respect who are also like that, who are doing this stuff, I've just had moments where I'm not like signing up for a psychedelics retreat, but I'm just like, maybe there's something in this. And so I'm more open to that than I would have been even sort of 5 or 6 weeks ago. So those are just a few things that I'm either reevaluating or I have reevaluated in terms of my own thinking.
So, Michael, one of the things you write about in the book, Mindstuck, is that it's not the change that causes us the pause, that causes
Mhm.
us to dig in deeper. It's not the concept of change. We actually are open to it. In fact, I've said many times, I ask people all the time, do you believe people can change? And the answer has been 100% of the time, yes. We believe people can change. In fact, change is part
Yep.
of the human experience. You write that it is that we're afraid of loss.
Yeah. Yep.
So in that rethinking of locking up your house, I mean, maybe we can maybe we can say, well, you're afraid of losing stuff in your house, but
Yep.
what was the holdup there? What was the loss there that you had to overcome?
So probably the loss for me that had meant I hadn't changed my mind previously was the loss of identity, loss of self.
Mm.
This sense of there was, I guess, a degree of pride that I'm not the sort of person who lives fearfully. I'm not the sort of person who does lock up doors and has bars in the windows. And so for me, the fear of loss was if I change my mind about this, then I'll lose that sense of who I am. Suddenly, am I not the person I used to be? And I think that's one of the big things that holds any of us back from changing our mind is there's a bit of shame, a bit of embarrassment, sometimes a bit of ego wrapped up in it. But one of the big things is the unraveling effect. This idea that if I change my mind about this one thing, what else have I not been right about? Or I might have to rethink. And that can be like a bit of a worrying sort of prospect. You like say, take the example of locking doors. Like, so what's the next step? Like, do I become now a super hyper vigilant, fearful person? And everywhere I look, I'm nervous about an intruder or someone who's going to rip me off. Or no, and that's not the case. But there is that sense of like, what if I change my mind about this? What else do I need to then rethink? And so I think that's the sort of loss that often keeps us bound up. That sense of losing our sense of dignity or self. And the moment that that feels like it's impinged on, that's when we dig our heels in, even if deep down we know that what someone else is saying is probably right and would even benefit us. We'll still fight back, and we all know people not like that. You can actually present to them a reason to change that they're going to benefit massively from, and they'll still fight you on it. And you think, wow, isn't that interesting? So I think that I'm trying to unpack, and that's what I really wanted to look at in the book is why don't smart people change? Even when they want to, even when they know they should, what keeps us fixed or stuck or rigid? And I mean, we're all susceptible to it, but I am mindful that temperament wise or for whatever reason, I am definitely very much vulnerable to this.
When did that become clear to you that it was this fear of loss rather than this fear of change that is in of all the things that you wrote about in the book? I'm going to sum it up as that we need to speak to
Wow.
the fear of loss rather than the fear of change, as we so often do.
Yep.
When did that become clear to you, Michael?
Well, I think probably halfway through the writing process, because I was sort of looking at there's lots of theories of change out there, and I think there's a fundamental assumption. I've heard it for years. I've written about it for years in previous books, and it's almost such an adage, a truism that we just assume that it's the case, and that is that humans are afraid of change.
Yeah.
And we've said that for so long, we just accept it as gospel truth. And yet every one of us knows times when like change was actually like as a breath of fresh air. It was as good as a holiday, and others around us was something about the way we positioned the idea that gave them the freedom to embrace it as their own. And you could just see the weight lift off them. So like people aren't afraid of change. So what is it that causes people not to change? And I think for me over the years, when I started to delve into this from a neuroscience and sort of behavioral psychology perspective, I started to think through the dozens, hundreds probably of experience I've seen of this with clients. I'd sit with a client and we talk about how things needed to change, and I would see that even with I could give really good reasons and all the benefits, and share price will improve, market share will grow, all the things that could be great and valuable, and still there'd be this, no, no, I don't want to do it. And we saw this play out in the culture wars over the last few years. I found it fascinating watching things like mask mandates, asking people to change their behavior and wear a mask when COVID was happening. And there was a really couple of really interesting pieces in the psychological press around the parallels between mask mandates and mandating seatbelt wearing
Yeah.
decades ago.
Yeah.
And you had people who were like, I will not wear a seatbelt. I would rather die like a free person than be told I have to wear a seatbelt. And eventually that changed and people embraced it, for all sorts of reasons. Often nudge theory played into it because that buzzing alert thing was so annoying. We just put the seatbelt on to avoid having the alert.
Right.
But they're just looking at so many things happening in society. Certainly in my own client work, I'm like, there is something going on here, and I wanted to look at what it is that causes that point of resistance. And when I started to realize it is about a sense of loss as opposed to just the change itself, so much clicked. I'm like, that is so fundamentally true. I've sensed it in myself, and I see it in others all the time. So it's funny, like what you've said there, like that was the thing that resonated most from the book. That's a common piece of feedback, and it was actually only something I popped in at I don't know, the last 10% of the writing process, and I'm sort of glad I did because it is obviously resonating strongly with a lot of
Right.
people right now.
Yeah. Okay, so can I give you something that like cognitively is dissonant in my mind
Uh huh.
about everything, about all of this? And you just said it. We've almost taken it as gospel, as people are resistant to change. We don't like change. We just kind of
Mm,
accept that. With everything that you've outlined in your book, I'm curious, how would you approach someone who still believed that we like you wrote a lot of science, you put a lot of scientific studies and a lot of
mm,
evidentiary support and a lot of information, Michael, in your book. And I'm like, but what if somebody doesn't believe all this? What if
yep.
somebody still doesn't believe that people like to change or want to change?
Yeah.
How would you approach them?
Well, it's probably a couple of things I would do. And I think and it's not just about this issue. You could apply these sort of strategies to lots of things. I would start by firstly affirming that, like, that perspective, like, you get it. You understand why they would think that. And there's this adage they've used in sales for years. And I first learned this at university in a persuasive communication course. It was like feel, felt, found. I know how you feel. I felt the same way. Here's what I found. And that little process of often overcoming objections from a sales perspective also works from a persuasion standpoint. Because the first point is you go, like, I get it. A lot of people think that. That's not an uncommon thought because that does is it affirms dignity. In other words, you're not an idiot for thinking this. But then it's like, well, I actually felt the same way. I thought the same thing. Until what I found was I read something and for me, at first I'm like, I didn't want to believe it. But I'm like, the more I looked at it, the more I considered it, the more I thought there's something here. And what I found is actually that there's a lot of research about this, blah, blah, blah. So feel, felt, found is a good approach. Also asking people questions about like, for you, how did you get to the point where you were so sure about that? Like, was there an experience or was there something you read? And often when you get people to pause long enough to think about how they arrived at their points of opinion or points of view, often they're like, I don't know, actually. I don't even know when I even started thinking this as a thing. And even that moment, that's not going to change their mind in that moment, but it opens the door, it softens them up because there's that sense that, okay, if I don't have a reason for thinking what I think, maybe I'm just open enough a little bit to consider that maybe there are things that I haven't thought of, that there's a more full picture I haven't considered. But I think the big thing is from the very outset, when you're engaging with someone who does fundamentally think a different way to you, to realize that, and this is like a fundamental important truth, that everything that everyone thinks makes perfect sense to them. Like even
Mhm.
someone, and we all know people who've gone down the rabbit hole of conspiracy belief, and you're like, how can you possibly believe that? And then fill in the blanks, like, QAnon believers. Like I read some of the stuff that they write, I think, how can you honestly believe that? It's extraordinary to me. But for them, it makes perfect sense. Otherwise, they wouldn't believe it. And so you got to start off by realizing that from their perspective right now, it makes sense to them. So the moment if there's a sense that you think they're a fool, or that you look down on them, or even that you pity them and you want to change them as an act of rescuing, people's dignity, they pick up on that straight away. Their ego kicks in, and it's about defensiveness then instead of being open. So I think the challenge in all of this is, how do you change someone's mind, or get them to a point where they can change their mind without having to admit they're an idiot before they change their mind? And yet we often back people into that corner. In order to
Mm.
reconsider a belief or an assumption, they almost have to admit they were a fool in the past. And none of us like to do that. And yet that's so often what essentially we give people, that option, and we wonder why they buck and they resist.
That keeping of dignity, of a person's
Mm,
dignity, was so striking to me in the book, Michael. It just, because what you just said, you're absolutely right. We try and press someone down to a smaller size than us, figuratively or
yep,
metaphorically, to get them
yep.
to acquiesce to what we want. I love the concept of keeping their dignity. These forces in our minds, these things that are that make us dig in, even when, as you have previously said here, that when we're presented with evidence to the contrary, we still dig in. How do we deal with that frustration as the person seeing someone who is not changing their mind in the ways that perhaps we want? How do we deal with our own frustration in those moments?
I think the first port of call has got to try and be empathy. How do you try and step into their shoes and go, even if I don't agree with the conclusion they've come to, what is it that's happened that may have caused them to get into a position where that's the conclusion they've drawn? So if you start there, I think that's probably the most valuable thing that any of us can do. That notion that, in fact, I was thinking, I wish this had been in the book, because I jotted it down for a journal article I wrote recently. I thought, oh man, I wish I thought of that a few months earlier. This idea of the best cure for prejudice is proximity. The moment you feel prejudiced against someone else, it's often because you haven't gotten close to them. You don't know them well enough. And so often when we see people who've got very prejudiced or strong views, particularly ones we can't identify with, just stop and check yourself first. Have you actually taken the time to try and see things from their perspective? Have you taken the time to listen? I had this great quote from Oscar Trimboli, who's written some great stuff on the
Oh,
power of
he
listening. Do you know Oscar's stuff?
he's been on the show. Yeah.
Has he? What a gem. So,
Oh,
I mean, I
love
love
him.
that insight from him, that the words silent and listen are made up of the same letters.
Oh,
And like there is something in that idea of, like, do we actually stop long enough and be silent long enough to genuinely listen, and not listen to try and, what's my response going to be, or how would I argue, or what's my counterpoint going to be? Like, I've actually stopped and listened through the person, not just to them. Like, what's the backstory? What's led them to this point? And I think that's so much of that creates an openness, because people who are listened to are more likely to listen. And yet, how often do we go into an exchange with someone with our carefully crafted arguments? If they say this, we'll say this, and we've got all of our plan of attack mapped out, with actually having taken this time to think, is there more to the story than I'm aware of? So I think these are simple things we can do to check our own heart and make sure that we're approaching with a degree of openness and humility, because that's what we want from the other person. Openness and intellectual humility. That's when minds change.
yeah.
And yet, have we actually gone in with the assumption that we've got it all right and they've got it all wrong? And one of the things I talk about in the book a little bit, and I try and remember this for myself constantly, is this notion of what I call the 2D trap, that we tend to see people firstly as two-dimensional.
Mhm.
And if you look at the two Ds that I sort of unpack in the book, we either deify people or we demonize them. That sense that if they're on our side and if they agree with us, we deify them. Like, they can do no wrong. Like, maybe there's someone from our tribe who we look up to, and they're the thought leader, and they're the one who are fighting the good fight. And almost we don't even see their flaws because we think they're so great. And yet we demonize someone from the other side, almost see them as irredeemable. And I think one of the challenges we're seeing right now from a political perspective, and you see this play out so often, is that it's not even that we're clashing over ideas, like left versus right, progressive versus conservative. It's not even really necessarily of right versus wrong. We've got to a point where it's now like evil versus good.
Yeah.
That's how politics is framed. The other side are evil and despicable. There's a sense of disgust that we often have for the other side of the political debate. simply because maybe we haven't got close enough to know them and to listen to their perspective. And that's often where the humility kicks off.
You're speaking my language. So many things that you have talked about here, Michael. Listening, asking questions, the dignity of another person, the nuance of another person, that whole frame of everything that you just did and said there, Michael. I'm curious, what is your response to perhaps you've heard some form of these things thrown out? Somebody says something we disagree with, and we say, that's BS and you know it. Or we
Mm.
say something like, well, if you can't see that, then I don't know how to help you, or then I can't
Yes.
help you.
Yeah, yeah.
What's your response to those types of I have a thing that I call them, but I'm curious, what's your response to those?
Do you mean how do I respond when I'm speaking to someone and that's what I want to say?
No. How do you respond to people who use that language when confronted with someone who won't change? That's BS
Yeah,
and you know it. That I'm gonna
yeah,
say that to you because I'm just so frustrated. Why can't you see this? Or, if you can't see it, I can't help you. I'm sorry. I'm out.
yep,
What do you say to
yep,
people who use that language? It's very
yeah.
prevalent. You look around and you see that everywhere.
Well, I think the first thing you got to always ask is, what's your goal here? Like, if you're engaging with someone who you disagree with, is your goal to win? Is your goal to shame them, to bludgeon them into changing their perspective? If your goal is actually to try and have influence, to persuade, because you genuinely think your perspective is valuable and they would be richer from the experience of taking on some of your views, which, I mean, that's the only reason we change people's minds, unless we're trying to manipulate them, in which case we want you to change because it's good for me. Like, and that's never going to play out well in the long term. But if your genuine goal is to get to the point where someone else can see something differently, and as a result, they'll benefit and the relationship will benefit. And the goal isn't to win. And I think this is the first thing, is like to ask yourself, what's the goal here? Is your goal, if from this conversation, the other person will raise their hand and go, you know what? You're right. I'm wrong. I was a fool. I can't believe I'd never seen it. Thank you for showing me the light. Because deep down, some of us actually genuinely think that's the way things will go. Like, if I'm successful in persuading this person, they're going to have this like road to Damascus experience and suddenly change their whole view. I mean, how often does that actually happen? The reality is, persuasion comes in the form of, like, you might say something and like they think about it. And then a few days later, like, you know what? There's something in that. I probably should read a bit more. I'm curious now. I'm open.
Mhm.
That's how minds change. And yet, if we're going in with the goal to win at any cost, and the goal is to like one up the other person and have better argument, better logic, better rationale, then you're never going to win. I mean, Andy Stanley, who's a leadership expert based there in the States, I love it. One of his books, he uses this phrase, and it was so true. He said, in any relationship, when one party wins, the relationship loses.
Mm.
And that is so true. Like, how often do we go into these exchanges with the goal of victory over the other person, a zero-sum game, which sadly is a very sort of post-enlightenment approach to argument. This idea that's all about presenting our most rational case and winning, trouncing our opponents. That's not what argument has been for millennia. Pre the Enlightenment, argument in the ancient times, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, argument for them was like bringing ideas to the table and thrashing them out. And if you were one-upped, if you heard an argument that made you change your mind, that was something to be celebrated, to be embraced, not to be ashamed of. And yet we've flipped that around, and so often we have this very battle war-like metaphor of, I'm going to win and you're going to lose, and I'm going to trounce you and you're going to capitulate. And of course, if that's the goal, it's never going to go well for you. In fact, even if the other person says, you know what, you're right, they probably don't mean it. It's like Dale
Yeah.
Carnegie said, someone convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. Their mind probably hasn't changed at all. They're just fed up of talking to you. They say what you want to hear so they can get away from you. So these are all the questions that I would ask other people to consider if
Yeah.
they're in that fractious thing, but also I apply to myself. What's my goal here? If my goal is progress, okay, and not winning, then that changes the whole posture and the tone of the conversation.
Yeah, those types of phrases to me, Michael, and I'd love your thoughts on this. They feel like, yes, at the surface level, it's frustration, it's anger that I believe in this thing. But to me, I think under the surface, it is a way to not stay in an uncomfortable and difficult conversation. It's an out.
Yep.
It's giving me an
Yep.
out where I can just stay within my rightness, my certainty, and not have to deal with trying those other methods that you just described, trying to make
Yeah.
progress and not win. How do you see it in a similar way? Am I off here?
Mm. No, I think that's exactly it. The reality is, It's harder than that. I mean, I find it hard personally.
Yeah.
This is so much of my goal in this stuff, in this book, is to help people come together and learn better. And then I find myself just still falling into that trap from time to time where I get frustrated with people. And
Yeah.
one of my tells, I don't know, everyone's got their tells for when like they're about to say something they shouldn't. You know, those things you just get a feeling in your body like, I probably should shut up right now. One of my tells is I'll get sort of hot around my throat and my neck, and the hair on the back of my neck goes up. It's like my hackles go up. And I've learned over the time, even if I am 100% sure that what I'm about to say is right, I've learned over the years to shut up. And particularly if it's like a public forum, like if I'm doing anything on radio or TV, I'm like, just I need to just stop. It's almost this instinctive, intuitive sense that either I'm off here, like I'm approaching this with the wrong perspective, or just there's something that I don't know about right now that either the right thing said at the wrong time or in the wrong way isn't the right thing. And so I might be having a point that's about to be bang on, so articulate, so accurate, so rational, but if I deliver it at the wrong time or in the wrong way or the wrong motivation behind it, it's the wrong thing. And so I've just learned those are my tells that I should shut up, stop speaking. And like I mean, even at home, like you speak to your partner or your spouse, and you're like, those things are, I want to say this right now. And I know if I say it, I'll make my point, but also it's going to like cause a very frosty, silent night in our house. You know, like what are the things where you just right time, right place, right intent? That's got to guide the way we approach all these conversations.
How long did it take you to recognize that tell in yourself, Michael?
Oh, I just over the years, enough times I walk straight into, like, ambush situations or just hurt people.
Yeah.
'Cause I grew up in a family where so I'm one of 5 boys, so there's a lot of, like, battle, fight each other, not physically fighting, but, like, there's that, like, blokes typically, boys are, like, a bit of binary, like, if you have an argument, it's like, we fight it out, we yell, we shout, then it's over, as opposed to the sort of the more silent, subtle, nuanced ways that, sometimes girls are more prone to do when it comes to, battles linger for a long time. We had another family growing up, there were 5 girls in that family and 5 boys in our family, and the difference in terms of, like, how fights happened, it was so, like, on and off for us, whereas stuff for them would go for days and weeks and fester. So I grew up in that environment where, like, it was conditioned that you'd stand up for yourself. And my parents were both scientifically trained, so around the dinner table we'd argue and debate and thrash things out. So I love a good argument. I love a good debate. But I've discovered over the years, especially being married to someone who loves to keep the peace, whose priority is harmony, not being right. I've learned that there are just times where I hurt people. I say things that might be right, but actually damage the relationship. And if just enough times you do that, if you're hopefully self-aware enough, you go, it's not great, it's not kind. And so even though I might be right and I'm in the right, what's the benefit, in the long term? So I think over the years I've just figured out, and yet I still stuff it up from time to time.
What is the and I know it's probably not a dividing line, but what's the messy gray middle between wanting to change someone, wanting to make progress with them, seeing the
Mm,
world differently and them being having of a different opinion and wanting to come to some sort of a common ground? What's the gray, messy, murky middle between that and manipulation?
yeah. It's a good way to describe it, the grey, murky middle, because it is murky. It's often unclear because even our best intentioned efforts often have just a shadow side. There's stuff in us that maybe is a bit selfish, and it
Sure.
doesn't have their best interests in mind. Even though most of us wants the best for them in this situation, maybe there is just part of us that wants to get our way and wants to manipulate. So I think this is where it is messy, and the reality is the same tools you can use to persuade people and bring the best out in them, to open their thinking, to hopefully to bring some sense of enlightenment or new perspective. Those very same tools can be used to coerce, to manipulate, to get your way with people in a way that actually harms them. And there's lots of different ways you can try, and I guess that's sort of having a straight line that you can measure yourself against, measure your actions and your attitudes. For me, the best tool or the best grid that I've seen over the years is something that is a bit like a hallmark of Rotary International. So if you're familiar with Rotary, they're like charity that does amazing humanitarian work, have been around for 100 and something years. So I've done a lot of work with Rotary over the years, particularly around strategy for them as an organization, how do they grow and stay relevant. And I've learned as I've worked with Rotarians that they've got this thing they call the four-way test. And I love this. And I think the four-way test doesn't just apply to conducting your business in an ethical way, because that's often the way it's applied from a Rotary perspective, but I think it applies from a persuasion as well. And so the four-way test is anytime you're going to say or do something, Ask yourself, is it true? Secondly, is it fair? Thirdly, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourthly, will it be beneficial to everyone involved? And I think if you can answer those four questions, that's a pretty good sign that you're using persuasive tools for good. But if deep down, like, is it actually fair? Well, maybe not. Maybe I'll win more than them. Just check yourself. Is it going to be beneficial to all concerned? Will it build goodwill? And this is where I think one of the key things is you might win the argument, but if it damages a relationship, you've violated the third question. It's not building goodwill, and
Yeah.
therefore tread very carefully. So now I find that a useful way of trying to bring clarity. But you're right, it's a grey area.
What seems to not be a gray area, Michael, based on your book, and I think a lot of the conversations I've had on the show and what I think you and I both just now have come to know to be true, is mocking, ostracizing, belittling, throwing facts, truth, your truth in the face of someone
Yeah.
does not work. Even when
Yep.
it is irrefutable fact, it does not work in getting to change someone's mind if they feel like it is being forced upon them.
Yeah.
Why is that? I mean, obviously, I'll ask kind of a maybe a leading question here, but why is that so important for us to understand in all of this?
Well, I think if you look at the neuroscience around this stuff, like what actually happens in people's brains, I think that's an important place to start. Because we often have this assumption that the best way to win an argument or to make a point is to give compelling logic, rational evidence. We often have this deep down assumption that if people don't see truth or don't see reason, that there's a knowledge gap. They're
Yeah.
missing some information. If we can just give them the information, then they'll go, oh, right, yes, I didn't realize. Now I know, and my mind is changed. That, of course, is not how it goes. And so if you look at what actually happens in our brains, there's what I often refer to as the two minds that we tend to operate in at any given moment. And we often use that phrase that I'm of two minds about this certain decision. And we use that to describe being indecisive, but there's actually something fundamentally true about that. And Daniel Kahneman talks about this as system one versus system two thinking. I sort of build on some of that work, but apply it in a slightly different way in the book. And the two minds that I look at is the first is our inquiring mind. And that's the part of our mind that is if you look at where it's located, frontal lobe, it's linear, it's logical, it's rational. It's also the most recent to develop. If you look at evolutionary biologists, will say this part of our brain is most recent to develop. And the thing is, most of us, when we're arguing, and when government agencies are trying to put together community change agendas and posters and billboards, they typically they appeal to the inquiring mind. They give logic and evidence and stats and numbers, and that's what the inquiring mind likes. The tricky thing is this: we actually only use our inquiring mind for 5 to 10% of our decision making and our perception formation. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of them is that it's just really hard to use. It takes energy and self-discipline and focus to use, and it's a slow piece of cognitive apparatus. So where does most of our thinking happen? It happens in something I refer to as the instinctive mind. Where that's located is sort of near the top of the brain stem, a part of the brain often referred to as the limbic system. And so this is the part of our brain that we use for pattern recognition. Often it's a very tribal part of our brain. It's very quick. It tends to react well to things happening around us, react very efficiently. The tricky thing is, this is where our fight and flight reflexes also reside. And so the very thing that's kept us alive as a species for millennia, a tiger jumps out, we react fast and we save ourselves and therefore our genetic line. The same thing happens though when we are exposed to intellectual threats. So if an intellectual threat, i.e. a bit of information, an idea or perspective that crops up that I feel threatened by, your instinctive mind will do the same thing as if it was physically a tiger leaping out at you. It battens down the hatches, it goes into attack mode, and fight or flight tends to be kicked off. And that's where so many of these tribal instincts also start to play out. And so if you look at where, if 90 to 95% of our thinking is happening in our instinctive mind, that's the mind you've got to change. And so therefore that requires a whole different suite of skills and approaches and techniques if you're going to appeal to the instinctive mind versus the inquiring mind. And yet still most of what we've done, and we've done it really since the Enlightenment, the last 300 or 400 years, we appeal to the inquiring mind and wonder why people don't see the light and don't change their thinking. There's something that's actually happening neurobiologically that's causing that to happen.
When we're in that, I'll call frame of mind, maybe that's not the right phrase, but when we're in that frame of mind, I've heard you say previously that we negotiate with reality.
Yes.
What did you mean by that, Michael?
So this idea of, this is where delusion kicks in, and we're all just a little bit delusional. The idea of, we'd like to think that, seeing is believing, and it's not. Like, you can see the best evidence and, things that are, irrefutably true, and then just choose not to believe them, or choose to perceive them in a very different way if they are threatening. And one of the examples I love, and I think it was Daniel Gilbert was writing a piece in the New York Times about this, and the way he put it was brilliant. He said, "You think about how most of us approached, weighing yourself on your bathroom scales in the morning. If you get onto the bathroom scales and it tells you the number you want to see, like, it's good news. You hop off as fast as you can, straight into the shower. It's like it's going to be a good day. But if you get onto the scales and the number is not one that you want to see, maybe there's a few more digits than you were hoping. Like, what do we? That's when we start to negotiate with reality. You hop off the scales. You're like, maybe they weren't sitting flat on the tiles. I'll do it again. Or maybe I was putting too much weight on one foot and not the other. Or maybe they need to be reset because they not need to be recalibrated. Like, this is when we like, because we don't want to see it. We don't want to hear it. And the interesting thing is, there've been lots of stats around how this applies to the way we approach information. We'll spend something like 36 to 40% more time reading articles or information or blog posts that we agree with, just because it's easier. We just enjoy it. It's gratifying to be like, you know what? Yep, these people are my people. They're speaking what I already believe to be true. When we're exposed to stuff we don't want to hear or don't want to believe, that's when the delusion or the denial sometimes kicks in. And you see this play out. In fact, we've had a situation just in the last hour here in Australia that I think the next day or two, this is going to play out. So I'll be curious to see how it does play out. But we saw the whole Israel-Gaza protest things crop up, just like they did around the world elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
One of the tricky things was that there were some accusations made that the pro-Palestinian people who were in front of the Sydney Opera House chanting, waving flags, there were these accusations that they were shouting incredibly, like, vile anti-Semitic things, like just the sort of stuff you go, wow, does anyone say that? But like, gosh, if they said that, then that's not on. That needs to be dealt with. There needs to be, and the police were called in. Anyway, in the last hour, they've just released the findings because the police went through, all these different camera angles and video footage, doing forensic analysis of what people were saying, because you can actually figure that stuff out pretty easily. These slogans apparently were not said. I mean, it made a great headline and
Mm-hmm.
it caused a whole lot of anger and polarization. But actually, the people who were protesting, the things they were purported to have said, they actually didn't say. Now, what's interesting is, so that's now evidence from the police, forensic analysis. But like, you watch in the next 24 hours, there'll be people who come out and go, I choose not to believe that, because the other side, I'm sure they would chant things like that because they're just so evil, vile, repulsive. And like, this is where polarization kicks in. If what you're reading or hearing doesn't match what you want to see to be true, it's amazing how you just do the mental gymnastics and negotiate with reality to try and see what you want. So, I mean, this we were all prone to it, but we're seeing it particularly play out when it comes to ideology-driven stuff, political
Yeah.
issues. This is often where it gets really fractious and messy right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's why the phrase alternative facts has entered our lexicon, Michael.
Yes, I know. It's a wild term, isn't it?
It's a trip. Uh, okay, so being smarter doesn't protect us from this, does it?
No. You'd like to think it would, wouldn't you? So highly intelligent people are, in many cases, just as prone to falling into the trap of conspiracy belief, for being deluded or deluding themselves. And interestingly, too, this is not a left versus right thing. You often hear it put forward in the media that those who are most likely to be delusional or engage in denial are, the right. You tend to hear this, like the conservatives. They're the ones who won't listen to reason. And yet both sides do it, and they do it in similar measures. It's just they do it about different
Yeah.
things. And there's some interesting research a
Yeah.
few years ago where, typically the right will be resistant typically to things like, science about climate change, for example. Even economics. If you try and argue that maybe trickle down economics just doesn't work the way that most people on the conservative right would like to think it does, they just can't hear it. We saw the same thing happen when, George Bush said there are weapons of mass destruction. We've got to go in and we've got to, go on the attack. There were people on the right who just, like, even when they were shown evidence that that was actually not true, they wouldn't believe it. But on the left, you see the same dynamic. You see people on the left who, no matter what evidence they see about genetically modified crops or the safety and the common sense of nuclear power, it's just, that's not the sort of thing we believe. We believe different stuff. It doesn't gel with our assumptions about reality. And so you see the same sort of denial of facts, this unwillingness to listen to things that we don't want to hear, things that are inconvenient or uncomfortable or threatening. That's just so deeply ingrained in us as humans. We're all prone to it.
I want to, as we begin to kind of slide down on the tail end of this, Michael, I want to go back to what I said earlier was so impactful for me was keeping people's dignity in this.
Mm,
What I have felt so much over the last certainly 10-ish years here in the United States is, especially politically or socially, in terms of a lot of the ideologies you just talked about, that we go into arguments trying to not just win the argument, not just trying to make our point, but embarrass and belittle the other side.
yeah. Yep.
And it breaks my heart to see that we feel like to win, to get ahead, we must make a mockery of who we don't agree with.
Yep.
And I'd love to go back to something you referenced earlier because you kind of skimmed the surface of it, but I really want to dig in here. How does feel, felt, found help us keep someone's dignity intact while still sharing a different point of view?
Yeah. I think the first thing it starts with is that sense of acknowledging that your view, your way of seeing the world, your perspective is okay. And I'm not going to judge you for that straight out of the gate. Now, in truth, there are some things that people think that you're like, you know what, I I, I I need to, I might have lost respect for that person because of some of the beliefs they hold, but how do I lose respect for them without losing regard? Even if they hold really
Mm,
crazy beliefs, or even beliefs that I find repulsive, they're still a human being and they therefore deserve dignity. They deserve me to at least listen and acknowledge them. And the moment you're unwilling to do that, you've started to see someone else as subhuman, which is never going to go well. I mean, that's just it. Just
right.
it means again, it takes that it's that two-dimensional thing, demonizing or deifying. And if you're demonizing someone, the moment you catch yourself saying yourself saying things like, "I can't believe how anyone would think dot dot dot," just whatever the end of that sentence is for you, like just step back and go, is it possible that you've demonized a whole group of people as being repulsive or, unacceptable, inexcusable? Because that's never going to be a good place to start. So the beauty of feel is it's like, I'm just going to validate, I know how you feel. And even if I don't know how you feel, there are a lot of people who feel the same way. So you start with that. You're just acknowledging that their belief is okay. Even if you don't believe it, it's okay that they do.
Or I
Oh,
can understand why you
I can
feel the way
understand.
that you do.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep, I can get it,
You're not
like, you
agreeing.
yep, it's just affirming that person and the
Yeah.
fact that it's okay. Because the moment you do that, what does that do? It disarms them. It's like, "Okay, cool, now I can listen because I don't have to be on the defensive, like, this person's not out to, like, make me a fool or challenge me or call me an idiot," and so feel is a useful first step for that reason. Felt is that sense of either I get it, I've been there, I felt the same way, or I know other people who felt the same way. Found is that here's what I discovered, and it's almost like you just take it for what it's worth. I might be way off here, but what I found when I like it puts it ideally in the first person. It makes it narrative driven.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone can argue with your logic and your evidence, but they can't argue with your story. And so, if you've got something you can share a story about how you or someone you know has gone through that journey of like thinking what they think, considering it, reading stuff, hearing a different perspective, meeting someone who challenged their assumptions and then suddenly going, but there's more to this than I realized. And then what they found was and how their mind changed. The process is not going to work every single time, but it gives you a bit of a model for affirming dignity as a starting point and then moving people through a process where they might just be open to considering things from a different perspective. So I think, yeah, starting with dignity is essential, and just realizing that when you feel really strongly about an issue, and you can't put a name to the issue, a face to the issue. Like, it's very easy to have strong, arrogant, obstinate views when it's just a principle, when it's a nameless, faceless issue. When suddenly that becomes a person, like, and I can think of an example of this, and it was so, to me, it was actually quite an interesting process to experience this. So toward the end of all the lockdowns, so in Australia, we had like massive lockdowns with
Right.
COVID. One city in particular, Melbourne, is I had the longest lockdowns of anywhere in the world. So I'm in Sydney. Ours were not great, but not as bad as poor Melbourne. Anyway, so we had all these lockdowns, and toward the end of the lockdowns, the messaging from the government was get a vaccine. If you'll take the vaccine, it's going to mean we can have at least take the pressure off the hospital system. Those who are vaccinated will have the vaccine passes. You can go out at the end of the lockdowns, go to hospital, go to shops, go to cinemas, like get back on with life. Those who haven't had the vaccine, yeah, if you haven't got your vaccine passport, you can't go into shops, can't go into cafes. And at the time, part of me was like, you know what? That seems fair. Everyone's had the choice to get the vaccine. They've had the chance. Those who have now have done the right thing. You know, I feel like there should be some privileges to that because we've done the right thing for the community. So, in honesty, that was sort of my view at the time. And I had a few friends who were like fully, they lost their jobs, willingly lost their jobs. They're like, I'm going to fight back. I haven't taken the vaccine and I don't care if I lose my job because I'm going to stand on principle. I'm like, really? Come on. Anyway, so I
Mhm.
was of that view. And I think a lot of people were at the time.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, the gyms then opened. I went back to the gym. And it was like the gyms had been closed for 5 months. It was great to
Right.
go back and see all the friends you hadn't seen for months that were doing workouts. And there's this one guy who I'd worked out with for like a year and a half, 2 years, and we'd all be in the gym, and he'd be outside in the parking lot. He'd have his gear, but he was essentially had to go out there because he didn't have a vaccine passport to show to get into the gym.
Mm.
And it was interesting. The moment I saw that, there was just something about it. I'm like, oh, that is so jarring. Like this feels like apartheid. This is like he's out there as the unclean, and here we are enjoying being back together again.
Mm.
And it just caused me to probably smooth off some of those rough edges. My firm sense that, you know what, yes, those who don't get vaccines, there should be a consequence for that. That was sort of my view. And I'm like, but when I put it to a face, when I see him doing his workout on his own, and this is someone that I know, that I value the relationship with, and I'm not working out with, even though we would normally have for years previous. It
Mm.
was like that was a moment putting a face to the issue, and I think that would be one thing I'd encourage anyone to do is when you've got a strong view yourself, can you put a face to it? Do you actually know people? And if not, get to know some people who represent the issue you're feeling strongly about. You may not change your mind necessarily about it, but at least you'll see it as more than two-dimensional. You'll see it as nuanced. Like humans are nuanced and complex, and there's value in that. That creates empathy and compassion. But also, if you're dealing with someone else who they've got that very rigid view, it's trying to like expose them to something that might just soften it for them. And maybe that's hearing someone's story, getting a chance to meet a person that will put flesh on an issue or an idea or a principle.
I am reminded in that story, and thank you for sharing that, Michael. That was incredible. I'm reminded of a quick thing that I highlighted in your book, a short sentence: "Lonely brains lash out."
Oh yes, yeah,
And then later on, you talk about in the book, not being afraid when you are met with defiance.
yeah.
Why not? Why does
So
defiance give you a signal that something's working?
often it's that whole like, if you look at the second theme first, so defiance is often a sign that consideration is occurring. It's almost like that. It's darkest just before the dawn. When people are pushing back, it often means they're considering and they're reflecting. And the thing you often don't want is apathy or complete passivity, because then you're like, it's really hard to steer that. But at least if someone's got a strong view, if they're bringing something to the conversation, even if it's robust, you can steer that. You can steer energy, but you can't steer apathy. So I think, don't be put off when people resist you, because sometimes, and I've seen this over the years at various points, and we probably all have, someone who's pushing back, and then they suddenly have a moment where they realize, actually, no, I can change my mind. And those people post that moment become the biggest advocates for the new way of thinking and the new way of operating. And it doesn't always happen, but there are times where sometimes that pushing back against is actually the process. It's almost like a birthing pain of a new paradigm. Like it's a part of the process of someone changing their thinking. So don't get put off by that and think their view is getting stronger and stronger. I'm just going to pull back and disengage entirely. Stay in the conversation, stay engaged with the person, value the relationship. And sometimes you'll see that's actually part of the process. The first one, though, about lonely brains lashing out, gosh, I found this interesting. So I came across this from a colleague of mine who's a psychologist. She cited this research in a conference, and I went up to her afterwards and said, that is so interesting. Where did you get this from? And so she shared some of the research that she dug out. And it was actually some work done by the University of Chicago. And they had done this over the years. They'd tested this a little bit, but during the lockdowns, first round of lockdowns in COVID, they were able to test at scale how people's brains respond to a lack of social interaction, because it's really hard to get a large data set of people not engaging socially until the pandemic hits and everyone's at home. And so, like, let's
Right.
test how people react to this. And so what they essentially found is the amygdala, which is a part of the limbic system, that very fight and flight focused part of our brain. It's only very small, but it's incredibly powerful. It's often where tribalism tends to stem from, a lot of strong emotions. So the amygdala, what they found is that when people had low connection with others socially, their amygdala shrank, but also the surface began to change, became rougher. And there's something about the fact that when your amygdala becomes smaller, you become less regulated in some of those strong, very tribal emotions.
Mm.
And is there any wonder that during lockdowns, that's when, just Instagram, Facebook, that's where people they just went off the deep end. Like that sense of the anger, the vitriol, the tribalism, the people getting radicalized by fringe beliefs online and going down rabbit holes of conspiracy assumptions. And a lot of this was because their brains just weren't functioning well. So we are designed to be in community. And something about having strong social networks means our brains function well biologically, but also in terms of the way we process information, socially. So I think that's probably a key lesson is that maybe you're dealing with someone who's really cut off from the world. That's one of the things that will cause them to be stubborn. And if you can get them around others, create that sense of community and connection, sometimes that in itself will right some of those very extreme things that you see in that person's psychology.
Before I ask my last question, I would love to wrap it up with something else that kind of building on that need for community, that desire to maintain my dignity that we've talked about throughout the entire time.
Mm,
I would just love to really drive home a point, and I'll just read it here from the book. Others need to feel that changing their behavior is not an indication that they were wrong in the past, but rather they now know something they didn't know before.
mm.
Help the listener understand why that switch in belief, in feeling, in goal setting for yourself is so vitally important, Michael.
I think what it does is it goes to this whole theme of dignity. It means that someone doesn't have to say, "I'm changing my mind because I was an
I
idiot and
was an
now I'm
idiot.
not."
Yeah.
It's like the view that I had was right for the time based on what I knew. I now know something different. And so giving people that ability to it's almost like giving people a way out, a trapdoor for saying, "I've changed my mind because now I know something I didn't," and it preserves dignity. And that idea that now that I've got a perspective I didn't have, I can think in a different way. Now, in truth, sometimes people use that and actually nothing's changed. It's just a way of making the change seem palatable to themselves or to others. It's a story they tell themselves about, I used to think this, but now I think something different. Well, actually, maybe your thinking hasn't really changed. Maybe you didn't learn really something fundamentally new, but it's a way of creating a narrative around the change that preserves ego. So I think that's a helpful thing is that when people feel like the process of change is because they've learned something, then suddenly I can update my beliefs. And it's not because I was an idiot and now I'm not. It's because I now understand something I didn't. And I think that's for all of us. That's a helpful thing to help ourselves be open to changes. Go, you know what? Maybe the belief I had before made sense for then, but I'm different. I'm different to what I was 12 months ago. And so therefore, I'm going to give myself permission to humble myself, update my thinking. And then obviously, if you can allow other people to do the same and not ever have that sense of you've backed them into a corner and when they change their mind, it's like, gosh, finally, we were waiting till you'd see the light, because then again, you're shaming them, you're
Yeah.
embarrassing them. So giving people that space and dignity is critical.
I love how that is encapsulated in the story that you told of your friend at the gym. You didn't have to admit
Mm,
that you were an idiot or wrong for your beliefs. And in fact, your beliefs, you even said you didn't change that much, but you had a fuller, richer view of
yeah,
the entirety of the situation and shifted just a little bit. And as you said in the beginning, progress is better, right? We're doing something over nothing, right?
correct. Absolutely.
Michael, I know you have, I mean, obviously, this is one of the best and most well researched books on change that I've ever read. I
Oh,
know
thank
you've done
you.
a lot of these interviews, but I'm curious, what's a question that you wish you were asked more about all of this?
Oh, I mean, that in itself is a good question. It's one that I haven't been asked a lot, hey. But I think the thing that I always like to unpack is stuff that we actually have covered, which is like what's the environment that means people feel they can change without being embarrassed. And I think often in a lot of these research, these sort of discussions, they get straight into the research and the tools and the tactics without understanding the heart behind it. So actually, I love the fact that we've gone more into that in this conversation than the tactical, do this, say this, try this technique. I mean, that's helpful. And the book is full of techniques and tactics and all the rest. But until you get the motivation right, the rest of it really doesn't matter. And I think one of the things that for me really resonated when I was writing the book, and it sort of changed the way I viewed the whole thing, was this notion of seeing debates or arguments as a dance, not a battle. And
Yeah.
for me, that's something that whenever that does sort of come up in conversations, I love it because I think it describes so well what the goal in changing people's minds is. When you go into battle, it's like I win, you lose. I take ground and ideally don't lose any ground. That's what winning a battle is about. And yet we so often approach arguments like that. Is that zero sum game? Whereas if it's a dance, and George Lakoff in his book Metaphors to Live By, this is where I got this principle from. And I know Adam Grant spoke about it in Think Again as well. This notion of if you see persuasion as a dance rather than a battle, Well, how does a dance work? It's where you step in. You get in step with someone else. You step forward, then you step back. You give a bit, and then you take a bit in terms of ground. And when you get into rhythm, that's when beautiful things happen. And so I think if we can see this as a dance where it's not about advancing and winning and trouncing the other person, but coming together. Now, the reality is there are sometimes people just don't want to dance. And that's the reality is you may not be the right person. It may not be the right time to have the conversation. Someone else might be the person to dance with that individual around an issue. You can't force it. Forcing people to dance is never going to go well. So
Nope.
this does require two parties to be open. But when that happens, that's when beautiful things occur. That's when we learn. That's when we grow.
And that is a beautiful answer to that question, and I can't thank you enough. I think that's a wonderful thing, a wonderful place to leave it, Michael. Thank you. I'm going to recommend this book to so many people. Like you have no idea, and I'm going to reread it because it is just there's so much good, rich information in there. Michael, thank you so much for writing the book, for sharing it and for sharing your thoughts and opinions and perspective with me here. I appreciate it so much.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's been lovely to chat.
I love the point that Michael made in this conversation when he said, "Can you put a face and a name to the issue? If there is something that you are absolutely against or something that you are 100% for and you're railing against the other side, quote unquote, do you have a network large enough that you can actually put a face and a name to an issue or the issue at hand where you have shared space with that person, not just your United States senator or the president or some major, huge podcast host? No. Have you shared physical space with someone who believes differently than you? If you don't have that ability, if you don't have that option to be able to consider the other side and be able to converse with someone about that issue, your network is too small. And when your network is too small, that's when the roots of identity take their ultimate grasp over your life. And that's where we begin to make enemies of the other side. That's where we begin to use force and evidence and data and proof and all the facts that we can to try and get people to change through sheer force and willpower rather than guiding them, rather than opening their minds, expanding their minds into the possibility that change might be able to happen. And here's the thing. You will not be able to get someone to change if the cost of staying the same is less than the cost of change. And when you remove someone's dignity from that equation, the cost balance will never turn out in your favor. So think about that. Think about how you're trying to enact change from people at work, from family members, from relatives, from friends, from total strangers on the internet. Are your motives and your goals matching your actions? And if you remove dignity, it will never happen. So many thanks to Michael McQueen for joining me here on this episode of The Follow-Up Question. Please do Michael and I an enormous favor and share this episode with your network. Help us spread the good word about the importance of asking questions and understanding how and why people change. It absolutely is a conversation that has to happen now more than ever. So please share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to this conversation. If you'd ever like to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. You can also learn about my speaking and leadership communications coaching. You can also subscribe to my email newsletter while you're there on my website. I would greatly appreciate it if you joined the many, many other folks who are on that newsletter, getting tips and tricks from me on how to communicate well with each other. That's it for this episode of The Follow-Up Question. I will catch you next time. And until then, please keep asking questions.